All right. Hey there, readers and storytellers, and thank you for joining me on Story Unfolding, a show about changing the world through creativity, ingenuity, and intellectual discourse. We share meaningful conversations with creators, creatives, and dreamers who take it upon themselves to make a difference in the world. We have an influence on the world around us regardless of our intent. The only way forward is by confronting the hard truths, asking the tough questions, and letting your voice be heard. We are better together each day with our human story unfolding. Now, I am pleased to have Abigail Manning on with me today. Abigail Manning is a wife, nanny, and author of YA or young adult romance. She resides with her husband, Marcus, in the beautiful state of Tennessee. In school, she studied both early childhood development and theater arts, both of which aided in the development of her Emerald Realm series based off of retold fairy tales. She has only recently begun her career in writing, but already has growing ambitions revolving around her blossoming stories. So, Abigail, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I am super excited to hear more about these retelling fairy tale retellings. That's a tongue twister there, because for those of you watching, we've had a pre-interview before this, and I got to talk to Abigail, and she's going to Disney World for her anniversary, I believe, right?
Yeah, our second anniversary.
So she's going to get to go with her husband during the 50th anniversary, and I'm a huge Disney nerd, so I absolutely love that and can't wait to get into that. But before we go off on a tangent, let's first talk about your work. So I have Poisoned Heart right here, right here next to me. That's one of your books from Emerald Realm. So tell us, and tell us all, the readers and the listeners, about your latest project.
Yeah, so Poison Heart is the first book in my series of fairy tale retellings, The Emerald Realm. And so Poison Heart is a retelling of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So each one of the books are actually standalones, but they go cohesively together with an overall kind of arcing plot and villain. Kind of like the Lunar Chronicles, if you've ever looked into those at all, which are amazing. I recommend it if you haven't. They are other fairy tale retellings. But they all have their own heroine who is the entire focus of the story. And so they each start with a brand new main character, and it's just the stories that we know and love, but it's twisted in a way that you wouldn't expect it. So Poison Heart retells Snow White, and the second book retells Goldilocks, and then it goes into Cinderella, and these characters are slowly introduced even in the books before they are front running in, so you kind of get to know a little bit about their backstory before you get to know their real story. So it's definitely kind of an interesting twist on something that you already thought you knew.
So the backstory of of Snow White.
Well, Snow White's the front runner, so her story is both her backstory and her main story. That is her story as a whole. But Snow White encounters a girl named Aurelia, which means gold, who is actually Goldilocks in the second book. So you actually get to know some of those characters before they come into play in the later books.
That's really interesting. So this fairy tale retelling, where did you get the inspiration to do that?
I've always loved fairy tales. When I was younger, I loved the really creepy, grim fairy tales that were where Disney got things from. I love looking back and seeing what inspired Disney to do what Disney does, or what inspired other retellings to do things like that. And when I started getting back into reading, I started getting into audiobooks. I listened to a couple retellings as well, and I was just fell in love with it and just realized how many there were and how many adaptations. It just was such a creative thought process to think of how many times you could retell a story and it never be the same. And I wanted to try my own take at it.
Now, are yours a little darker than Disney, or where would they lie?
I would definitely say they're like PG-13 almost. They're completely clean. There's no excessive gore or violence. There's no excessive romance, and there's no swearing in them. They're very a teen could read them without their parents snooping over their shoulder or anything like that. But they are definitely beyond Disney. She's not sitting in the woods singing with the squirrels and the birds. So there's an assassin, there's all kinds of espionage happening. So it's definitely a little beyond Disney.
Okay, this sounds like right up the alley of my 9-year-old. So she reads Grimm's Fairy Tale. I think we talked about that. She walks around with that Grimm's Fairy Tale book just like you did. So she probably loved your stories. So I'm going to have to check them out, definitely. So I'm curious, you said that, so let's see, you were in the early childhood development, you've worked with kids a lot. So how has that and the rest of your lived experience really impacted, this project and your decision to become a writer?
I mean, it's definitely had a big influence because obviously, as someone who works with kids, I read fairy tales all the time. I read Goldilocks, I read Snow White, I read Rapunzel, just in, lesson plans when I was in daycares and now as a nanny, just in whatever books the kids have. So I definitely always kind of got the idea of like thinking back to those children's stories and thinking back to like where that came from. And just working with kids in general is just so inspirational to see kind of where their mind goes and what they pull from nothing. And I was never really interested in writing until I finished my early childhood degree, because one of the classes that I took was a creative writing course and I really wanted to pursue that, and then ended up switching to theater because I realized I didn't have to take a foreign language, which sounded appealing at the time. So I just kind of like fell back into it during COVID, when a lot of people did, when I had the time to really write and just kind of dive into stuff, but didn't really start really pursuing it until almost a year ago. So definitely just the inspiration from what I see kids think of and do, and reading their stories and wondering how I could reimagine into something bigger is kind of where that all stemmed from.
And do you wish you learned that foreign language?
Sometimes, yeah, it would have been helpful.
Yeah, I did the same thing. So when I started my program for archaeology, it was pretty late in my college career, and I loved classical archaeology. So I loved Rome, and that's what I really focused my stuff on. But I couldn't be a classical archaeology concentrator because you needed to do Latin and ancient Greek. And I was like, college me was like, no. Now I wish I knew Latin. That'd be awesome. Especially now that I'm a writer. I mean, I would love to integrate that into my stories, but I'm like, oh well, I'll pick it up on Duolingo or something. So I'm curious about, so you're retelling these stories, you're putting a new twist on it. What would you like your readers to take away from your stories?
So my stories all kind of have like an underlying kind of like, not really life lesson, but theme that kind of goes with them. So in Poison Heart, for example, the main character starts off very bitter and selfish. She's always been told she's beautiful, and so she's developed this ego that comes with it, and thinking that her beauty is what makes her, as opposed to thinking that it's just something that's an attribute of her. And she kind of puts her identity in that. And so when she's forced out of her home, like in typical Snow White, and she's forced to live with 7 women in a laundry mill to try to hide her identity, she really has to learn the lesson of humility and learn what other people go through, and like why she shouldn't be putting herself on this pedestal, even though she has this rank. And so I kind of have something like that in all of my books, where there's just something lingering in the background. Well, yes, it's a sweet retelling of a fairy tale, and there's princesses and there's romance, but there's something deeper inside that's kind of like jarring, and that makes you think like, well, maybe we should be a little more thoughtful about what we already have instead of looking at what we don't have, or maybe we should kind of be more thoughtful of like what our appearance is and if it's really that important to us, as opposed to what something else could be important about. So it's kind of stuff that I sneak in there.
Yeah, so it's really digging into like some major identity issues, figuring out, I had this great conversation earlier today about how our lived experience and how, everything that we have been exposed to really determines our decisions and our perception of the world. And I think that goes hand in hand with identity as well. And I think that's something that you're hitting on there. That's really interesting. So I'm curious, I know a lot of these retellings will kind of change the story of the villains. Do you do anything with that?
Yeah, I actually really play around with the villains. The first book has kind of a villain that you don't know is the villain or not, and you don't really get that answer until the very end. And at the same time, there's a secondary villain who's kind of like in the background that becomes a bigger and bigger problem as the series progresses, until the very end book, which is not published yet but is written, is kind of like the big standoff and finale with that villain. So there's always a minor villain that's not really minor because they're major in that character's perception, but there's always something in the background that's kind of stirring up more trouble and causing more problems until it's overtaking the entire plot by the 5th book.
Now, is there a standard kind of formula? Do you keep your heroines, do they stay the heroine, or are there any ones that might switch roles or be, I don't know. Do they stay the main character and the heroine, I guess is my question.
Yeah, my main characters in each book definitely stay. Like Arabella is just that, which is the Snow White in the first book. She's only in her first book in terms of a main character. She makes cameos in later books where she's kind of like pops in here and there for, you know, whatever the plot needs occasionally. But other than that, it's just her story is the first story. But some of them do play a heavier role in later books. So like the main character in the second book actually plays a heavier role later on in the fourth and fifth book, but she's not the main character anymore. There's a new main character that kind of takes over that. And so there's always somebody else that you're focusing on, but the other people don't just disappear either. They're still in there.
Okay. So how long are these books? Because I know fairy tales can range widely, especially being for kids it's sometimes, but you say yours are for adults as well. Like are they pretty long or?
They're pretty average. They're about 70,000 words a piece.
Okay.
So about 20 to 25-ish chapters per book. They're fairly quick, easy reads, but they're not epic. They're not super short novellas either. They're just kind of in that sweet spot.
Okay. For those of you readers who don't know what 70,000 words look like, that's your standard novel, a little smaller than some of your big ones, like if you think Anne Rice or anything like that. I think, it's really not too long at all. So that's a very quick read. I'm curious. So you did talk about this a little bit, but some of the perspectives and beliefs that you may have challenged in your stories. I know you talked about the villain. Or is there anything else that you tend to talk about or use in your themes?
Yeah, I really like to challenge the idea of redemption stories where you kind of get to the point where you feel like a villain is just only set out to be a villain, and then just kind of testing to see how far they can go before they can be brought back. I'm kind of a big believer of like, you're never too far gone to go back on the right path of what you need to be. You like, no one is ever like, can't be like, come back to like something good if they've been straying too far from where they want to be. So I kind of try to incorporate that in the stories as well, where in the fourth book, the main character or the main character's love interest is actually one of the villains of that's kind of been carrying on the story of the background plot throughout the entire series. But even though you don't really like know as much about him and you just know that he's the villain, you kind of get to go inside of his head and figure out what makes him that villain. And then you get to see him kind of come back and kind of abandon the part that was what made him a villain. And that happens like with a couple different characters. It's not just him, he's just the biggest kind of example. But I really like to play around with like, how far can somebody go before they can come back, and what's that process like? How do you redeem yourself after something so awful? And how do you make it easy? Like how could it, it's not going to be easy, but how do you proceed with that?
Okay. So we see some growth in both your main characters and your antagonist, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's really cool. That kind of leads us into another question that I wanted to ask about kind of the relationship between writing and culture. So for me, culture is a huge aspect in why I decided to become a writer. I run a travel business. It's all about bridging cultures. So it's very important to me, and it was important when I started this channel. And I realized, writing is just another medium to put out a message, right? And whatever we put out to the world, it's perceived by people of different cultures that have different experiences than I do. So I may write something with this intent, but other people may take it a different way. So I'm interested in your take on how you see that relationship between writing and culture, and also between kind of the boundaries of fiction and reality, especially with regard to your works.
Yeah, I really think that like kind of writing is a carrier of culture, where you can put things that you may not have like that may be very specific and very researched to a specific culture that's carrying on that legacy of what people need to know about it. Or at the same time, it can kind of inspire a culture to maybe feel like that's something that they want to take on, or it's a transportation of explaining what culture is in another format. So if you're putting in like, some sort of like tradition or some sort of holiday in your story, and that's passed on throughout the years, and that's explaining that holiday, even if it's through a fictional means, to people who may not have understood it before. So it's carrying that culture with it. And it can also be very influential on culture. It can kind of, highlight things that maybe people were blinded to. It can kind of, maybe show things that people weren't knowing how much to appreciate until they saw it highlighted in the story of literature, and they really liked that. And that kind of inspires them to progress with whatever they're going through or whatever they're exploring. And yeah, as far as, fiction or literature versus reality, fiction versus reality, I personally see it as a much harder line between, what's real and what's fiction, because fiction is kind of meant to be an escape for some people, where it's something that you want to like escape to and let your mind think about something that's not real, but then when you're done escaping to come back, then you can let it influence the real stuff. But it's not like, they're one part, they're one influences the other. So there's kind of the separation of the part where it's just kind of, fictional, it's, imaginative, it's thought-provoking, and then putting that and interpreting it into your real world.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a different answer than I've gotten from other authors. So that's really refreshing. I like that take. So let's see. Another thing that is really big, I think, kind of has a lot to do with your stories and kind of the redemption aspect. So there's a lot, going on in the world with intolerance and divisiveness. And I think, this redemption component is something that a lot of people don't really grab hold and put into their, they don't really put that into practice. There's a lot of once a mistake is made, it's set, and it doesn't change. And once your, identity is created, that is who you are. So I'm interested, what one thing would you ask your audience to do to help inspire social change?
I mean, I would definitely say in terms of the idea of, redemption and being someone who's like, can look for the better in people even after they've strayed, is just kind of the idea of staying humble. It's so easy to just follow the role of this person was, this person did something that I didn't like, I'm going to cut them out. That's kind of the cancel culture at times, where it's like, this person was toxic one time, I want to be done with it. And just kind of the idea of looking humble and looking at yourself first before kind of doing that and thinking, well, where do I stand in this? What have I done to maybe provoke this? Is this person really just that, or am I seeing it through this specific lens? And just kind of always starting with yourself before moving on to putting it on somebody else. And then being open to forgiveness for when people have those redeeming qualities and they do come back. And just kind of, I'm not like, I'm the big person when it comes to like always looking to see if someone can come back from something, because you never know what that person's been through outside of what you know, and you never know where they're going to go from there. So just always kind of like staying humble and starting with yourself, and then doing your best to be a little more accepting of what they might be going through, where they might be going, instead of just blocking out and assuming what you want to assume.
That's amazing. I feel like that's kind of what you wrote into Snow White, right? Or what's her name? I'm sorry.
Arabella.
Arabella. So you mentioned that she kind of falls in love with a villain, right?
Not in her story. It's actually the fourth.
Okay.
Of the villain. But yes, there is a villain gets fallen in love with.
Okay, so obviously, your opinion in the real world is, influencing the way you write. So I think that's really interesting. Now we're coming to the close, so I want to touch on a couple more big things first, and then there's one small thing I'm going to ask you personally about you. But let's continue on this trend of social issues. So if you could pick one maybe three social issues, 1 to 3, that are important to you, that you would like your readers and your audience to address, what would those be?
For me, the one big one that is always the top of my mind is just the concept of fostering, specifically in the United States where I'm at. I don't know the details of it within other countries, but just the idea of where fostering is like the neglected kind of thing a lot of the times, where it's just looked at as a paycheck, or it's looked at as something that you can do to earn brownie points. That is, again, I work with kids. I've seen kids throughout all walks of life. It's something that I've done for 8 years now. And that's just the one thing that's always like big on my heart, that I always want to inspire social change for. It's for people to stop either treating it as something that isn't really that important, that they can just forget about, or neglecting it entirely, or doing it for the wrong reasons. And so my just kind of inspiration to everyone is to just consider like researching it more if you're somebody who's interested in it, or being supportive of people who do go through it, because it's something that's very forgotten. It's something that a lot of people go through, and it's shaped a lot of adults that could have had completely different lifestyles if they were put in different situations.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so the last 2 questions really lead us into a challenge that I asked some of my authors to put out. So I believe you had a challenge. I don't know if you remember it, because you sent me the written format quite a while ago. So we're finally getting around to this. I had life hit me, a million times. But do you remember what that was, or do you need me to remind you?
If I'm not mistaken, I think it was about staying humble.
Yes, it was.
Okay. Yes, that's definitely my kind of motto is just, stay humble. This world likes to really make us put ourselves on a pedestal, and which is great at times. You should always be proud of what you do, but just remember where you're grounded at, remember where you come from, and use that to help others and put others on the pedestal when you can, because it's always about pushing others forward and then they'll push you back.
And then your followers can put at stay humble on social media, right? And then they can
Yes.
engage with you. So that's great. Before I ask you the promised question that I have, let us know where we can find you and what's next coming up for you.
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. All my handles are Abigail Manning Author. You can also find them all at abigailmanningauthor.com. They're all collectively in there along with my newsletter.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome, great. And all those links will be located down below. And then you can also find the full written interview on my website at michaelcamarillo.books.com. It's not up yet, but it will be up soon, probably by the end of the month. So definitely go over there and check that out, and then click subscribe if you want to hear more from authors like Abigail, and hopefully I can have her come back again. Now, without further ado, the question on everyone's mind: what are you looking forward to most at Disney?
Oh my goodness, all the rides. I'm a roller coaster junkie. I'm so excited to go. I know Guardians of the Galaxy roller coaster just opened up or is about to open up, so I'm hoping it'll be ready when I get there. Oh, I'm very excited.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so funny story, I hated roller coasters my entire life until we went to Disney World last May, and my daughter's 8, and we've been to all the different Disneys, and I never rode roller coasters. Nope, didn't do. But she was 8, she's adorable, and she was like, please ride them with me. And I'm like, okay, fine. And I was freaking out, texting my wife the whole time, like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. Now I absolutely love them. I probably will not do roller coasters anywhere but Disney. I don't think I've gotten over the hump that much, but I did every single one at Disney World. Everest is amazing. Expedition Everest. The Rock and Roller Coaster was so fun. I loved them all. And then we went to Disneyland later that year, and I rode the roller coasters there too. So if you ever make it out there, do what's it called now? It's the Incredicoaster. That's my daughter's favorite. So it's really fun. But yeah. So no more Disney nerding out. But thanks again for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful anniversary, wonderful trip, and keep us all updated. And I'd love to have you back.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.